Welcome to Vision Heart blog number 4. We're going to continue on with the analogy of the elephant, seeing each part of the elephant, being a blind man, so to speak. We're all blind unless we're really enlightened, to a degree. Each of us holding on to our particular part of the elephant, a particular view of the universe, a particular view of reality, and so on. And then the trap is that it's great to have a view, to have a point of view, to have a paradigm, a way of looking, and that's great, and that's how we function. But what the problem is when that personal identification comes in, and then that's when the ego comes in to reinforce that view. And this is where we shut down, because for most of us, once we find something that works, that's it, and so on. Problem is we're in a culture now, a world culture, and with our society, a multicultural society, a multicultural world. It's a world society now, and so on. And so we are constantly being exposed to other parts of the elephant, and so on. So it's not so much that we don't know what's down there at that end of the elephant or what's down there at that end of the elephant. We do, and we can no longer feign ignorance or be ignorant, and so on. And as they say, ignorance is no excuse in the eyes of the law, and so on. So the challenge is how do we open up? How do we do that without fear? Because this is where identification with a singular point of view can actually generate a fear state. Is if you're not secure in that view of yours, if for whatever reason there's a kind of insecurity that brings in a fear state, then that paradigm that you have, your view of the trunk or the ear and so on, collapses into a very tight, very, very claustrophobic, sometimes maybe even paranoid point of view, where everything outside of what you think and what you believe becomes dangerous, becomes a threat. And this is the difference between an open person and a person who's living in a fear state. Usually we find people in a fear state are very closed, and they're also very adamant, and they're absolutely certain. They're absolutely certain. There's no doubt in their mind whatsoever about everything. Everything is spelled out in black and white. Everything is very clear. The boundaries are set, and they're fiercely defended, and so on. And I think the more adamant somebody is, the more strident they are in pronouncing their view or defending it, or in some cases actually being very aggressive with that view, we find that that's usually a person that's in a fear state. Most people who commit crimes of aggression are actually people who are really tortured in their worldview. They're very threatened. They don't understand what's going on. And there's fear also of loss of identity. There's a fear where the ego is threatened. Somewhere along the line, they haven't developed a strong enough ego, in the sense, the ego is a double-edged sword. It's necessary for us to function, but it can get out of hand. Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, there's a mouthful, who was one of the founders of the Theosophical movement, said one thing that really stands out in my mind, and that is, mind is a good servant, but a cruel master. And by that, she meant the everyday mind, the cogitating everyday mind, the mind of our egos, the mind that identifies with what we would call the small self. Me. And this ties in with our collapsed worldview and so on. If that ego has received or was nurtured in such a way that it's secure and it's not frightened, and it's not frightened of other things, it's able to open. And this is where we find the most intelligent, the most advanced. The people who've contributed most to this world are the people who don't have answers as much as they've asked really important questions. And this is I think, the hallmark of a very fine mind, of a very enlightened mind, and so on. And then everyday person can be enlightened, and so on. I think, for example, my mother is a very enlightened person with a very, very limited education, and yet there's a sense of perception there. There's an openness to hearing what other people have to say. It's actually quite remarkable, her willingness to open to so many different types of people, so many different types of things. And yet, here's a woman that is very secure in what she believes and what she thinks and what works for her and so on, and yet she's willing to allow something else. It's quite wonderful, and so on. So I want to look at a particularly good Zen story. There's a really good Zen story in a book by Paul Reps called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. It's well worth looking at, whether you are big on Zen or Buddhism and so on. Just as something to read, to open up the mind. There's nothing like the simplicity of Zen stories to really... They do something that really cracks the mind open and so on, and it's really very interesting. So anyways, the Zen story. A very scholarly man who knew a lot about the Buddhist sutras and so on. This is a Japanese story, Japanese Zen story. He knew the sutras, he had studied the sutras, he was very well versed in. So he was a professor of religion or philosophy or something at a university and so on. And he came to a Zen master because he wanted to learn more. He felt that his knowledge had reached a limit, had reached a peak and so on, and yet he didn't feel peace. He didn't feel that sense of oneness with reality around him and so on, and all. He had understood intellectually what Zen was about, but he didn't get it. But that's because he hadn't practiced it. So he came to the Zen master, and he sat down and he made sure that the Zen master knew who he was and what his accomplishments were and what he knew and so on. And he said to the Zen master, I want you to teach me. I want you to be my master. And the Zen master sat there quietly listening to the man, and then he said, all right. He said, but first we'll have tea. So typical, he did the Japanese tea thing. He put the bowl down in front of the man, the professor. The professor was very happy that he was going to be taken on by the Zen master, and he was thinking, I can also help the Zen master. I can really help the Zen master with my understanding of the sutras, which is unimpeachable. So while he's thinking this, and the ego is starting to really swell here, he's been accepted by one of the great Zen masters of the country, and so on, and what a perfect marriage this will be. He, the great professor, and the Zen master, one of the great, most reputable Zen masters in Japan. Beautiful. The Zen master takes the teapot, leans forward, and pours tea into the man's teacup, and so on. And the man is watching as the Zen master is pouring the tea, and the Zen master pours the tea until it gets to the top. And then he keeps pouring. And he pours until it overflows. And now it's overflowing onto the mat. It's overflowing all across the table. The man is sitting there absolutely befuddled, doesn't understand what is going on. Why is the Zen master doing this? The Zen master is still pouring the cup. He's not moving. He's not varying. There's tea everywhere. It's pouring off the table. The man pulls back his chair. He's wondering what's going on. And finally, he can't stand it anymore. He says to the Zen master, he said, Master, I don't understand. I really don't understand. And the Zen master said, No, you don't. He said, how can I fill this cup if it's already full? All of a sudden, the man went, and he realized that he was full, and so on. If we're going to open to something different, if we're going to open to something new and we're going to learn something, we have to be able to open. To open is to not be in a fear state, is to be in a state of calm, be in a state of acceptance, and be in a state of security. That is probably one of the most important things that we can learn about seeing the whole elephant. Time is up, and I thank you for watching. If you have any questions or suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.